Welcome back. I'm joined today, as you can probably tell, by Mr. Martin Popoff, the Swami of all things metal, to use a phrase that Martin likes, Swami. Martin, how are you?
Doing good, doing good. I don't know if I'm the Swami of all things metal. I'm the Swami of a bunch of old metal and a bunch of dad rock, but I definitely am greatly obsolete by this point. So
That's fine. We're all analog signals in a digital age. So Martin's kindly joined me to discuss the early output, the only real necessary output, if you ask me, of Holocaust, the NWOBHM or NWOBHM, new wave of Scottish heavy metal band from, well, formed very late 70s, but early 80s, essentially, for all intents and purposes. Martin, you have a bit of history. Indeed, one of your books even has a Holocaust connection. Do you want to talk us through
yes,
it?
I literally named one of my books after a Holocaust song, "Smoke and Valves: A Headbanger's Guide to 900 New Wave." It's a bit of a cheeky title because 900 records, of course, includes a lot of singles.
Yeah.
But yeah, all the albums as well. So there was a trilogy of these new wave of British heavy metal books. The other two are timeline with quotes, so they're like oral history with quotes. But yeah, so I named one after that, and I think one of them was Wheels of Steel and This Means War. But yeah, I've always loved this album. That's obviously one of the songs off of the debut album there.
Yep.
But yeah, just looking for titles for books, and this was always one of our our favorite cool new wave. I won't go into it any further than that, but yeah.
So the album itself, the Nightcomers,
Yeah.
1981, but it was preceded by a couple of singles, including indeed Smoke and Valves. But Heavy Metal Mania was the first single, backed by Love's Power and Only as Young as You Feel. Rather unusual title for a baby band, but regardless. Um, Heavy Metal Mania in this primitive version, quite a different version from the one we get in the album. It starts out with what a cliche it is now, but an air raid siren. How many of those 900s have an air raid siren in them? I wonder. Quite a few. So this is quite a different. It's almost an upbeat party version of the same track that we'd know from the record. And to be honest, this isn't a very heavy metal mania version of heavy metal mania.
Right.
It's much more of a catchy single version that you can imagine them sending to John Peel to try and get played on the radio more than anything else. And then we get the aforementioned Smoke and Valves, and then they would go on to record the album, the first release for Phoenix Records. They were one of those bands who were the one and only on their own label run by John Mayer, but not that John Mayer. He was only a kid at the time, who was operating in Edinburgh under a record store, and knew that metal was selling well, and there was this band who were coming into the store, and he decided, well, they're an obvious candidate to be my guys. Um, Martin, what was your history with it at the time? Coming through the band and whatnot.
Yeah, I think probably I feel like I got the album, the LP version of the Nightcomers before I got any of the singles.
Mm-hmm.
Loved it. I that is such a iconic new wave of British heavy metal type cover with the monochromatic two color printing. It's a very spooky sort of cover. It's got a really enigmatic title.
Yeah.
So this was just one of those that was around, one of the early ones to get. And I mean, this is a band. It's interesting that a lot of these new wave of British heavy metal bands. There's probably a good show here. Like, when did these bands all start off? And 1974 springs to mind for a lot of bands. And this is a much younger band than that. They started in 77, which is insanely young because when they make this album, they're like 17 years old, kind of thing, right? But it's a type of an album that has a lot of charm to it. It's well written songs, but they're not particularly complicated. You've got a vocalist in Gary Lettuce who is a little bit of one of these these singers that's maybe doesn't have a lot of tools in the toolbox, like not a lot of skill, but he's got a charming voice, which is you know, I always talk about guys like this as being bedheaded Dennis the Menace types, you know, sort of like an Ace Frehley, but he's also a lot like a Jess Cox on the first Tigers of Pantang album, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, it's the only one Jess Cox sings on. And you can tell, you know, John Deverell can sing Rings Around him, but there's a certain charm to Jess Cox, right? And there's a certain charm to Gary here, right? He's got that sort of spoken, drawly, you know, we've been drinking beers sort of voice going. And he just sounds like a committed metalhead, and it's really cool. You know, another band it reminds me of a little bit is Hellenbach. You know, the new wave of British heavy metal, Van Halen, as they used to call them. But it's really raw, right? And this is super raw. But the interesting thing about this album, and I wrote up a short story of this album that you could get as a 99-cent ebook at Zunior.com as well. Interviewed John, and you know, one of the things I remember him telling me about it is that this was actually a really nice studio, and it was not recorded live off the floor, even though it's got that vibe to it. But he said it was recorded all properly, track by track, and all that stuff, and it was a really professional sort of situation putting this album together. But it does sound, it is definitely a really rough and punky and cool one that way. Like I say, I think you definitely feel a super sturdiness to the songs, you know, the way we might talk about, you know, good quality Kiss or Beatles songs or whatever, right? Or if you want to keep it new wave of British heavy metal, to me, this reminds me of an album that has the charm of like the first Grim Reaper album, where you're not really feeling that you love this record because of the you know, sophisticated riffs on it. It's more about the sturdiness of the songwriting and the performances. You know, the performances are much better on the Grim Reaper. I mean, this does sound like a bunch of kids, but it's got the charm of that as well, right? Yeah. But yeah, the performances, the production, you know, the really sort of raw, you know, white hot and raw, but still fairly correct. You know, you don't feel a lack of bottom end or a lack of top end. I mean, everything's kind of there, but it's really smeary and drunken, and it just feels like almost like the most enthusiastic embrace of the new wave of British heavy metal. And I think that's what rubbed off on us as kids getting into this album. It's like, these guys really sound like they mean it.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're right, especially about Gary as a vocalist. He sounds like a guy who's won the chance to sing in a band, and he's going to make every moment count. He's having an absolute riot. You would never confuse the music that they are putting out with some of the major bands of the scene. And I think one of the reasons for that is, as you alluded to, they formed in '77. If they'd have formed the exact same guys in '79, I wonder if they would have been more metal-based, more NWOBHM traditional as we think of it. But they do still have this very punky attitude that you can tell comes from being teens when punk really hit. And I think that kind of permutates, if not all the album, then certainly a good chunk of the album. You can hear they've got more in common with the Motorhead side of things than they do with, say, the Maiden side of things.
Plus 70s heavy metal, like 70s hard rock. And that's a combination of, you know, you hear a little bit of America in here, you know, more so than like a Thin Lizzy, UFO, Judas Priest, Rainbow thing. You hear just as much of a yeah, I guess Van Halen, it does have a few albums out by this point. So yeah. You hear a little Van Halen and Aerosmith and Ted Nugent or whatever in it as well. So all that's mixed in because this new wave of British heavy metal thing is pretty new. You know, I do feel like you do get hints of the more cavemanish Iron Maiden, and I think you get hints of Angel Witch here as well, because there is a little bit of doom, tritone, you know, Diablos in Musica to some of what they're doing. I mean, they are metalheads, and every song is heavy, and it's cool that way. So yeah, a little bit of everything mixed in. But just one of those good old college. It's almost like it's the Ace Frehley 1978 solo album of the new wave of British heavy metal.
Yeah, I mean, they're never going to come up when people discuss like great dual guitar bands or anything like that. You're never going to confuse them with the Priests or the Maidens and whatnot in that regard either, or in a rhythm section. Even though I think the rhythm section here are, again, if professionally naive is a term, I think we can coin it if it isn't. There is something about them that has that. Yep, we've got a big studio. Everything's been recorded great, but we're bringing the naivety to it, and that kind of shapes it in a different way from a lot of the bands who were on the scene. That I guess wasn't even really a scene then. It was just kind of, this is what music is for the moment. I mean,
but I will add, Davey, that I want to say that I definitely remember back to those days, and this was an absolute head and shoulders classic along with all of the others. They just all had different positives and negatives. But basically this was one of the top 15 albums of the new wave of British heavy metal. It wasn't, we didn't put it down for any reason at all. It just had different charms about it than other ones.
And yet it did disappear for 20 years. It wasn't reissued. CD wasn't out until the 2000s, which is just crazy. Absolutely crazy. So I guess a combination of distributors, and they were never on a major who could therefore buy up their minor singles and album from earlier on in their career, like some other bands did. They obviously had the slight patronage of being covered by Metallica on the Garage Days EP, I guess. Lars was quite open that Holocaust was one of his favourites, along with Diamond Head, and they kind of shaped that sound. And you can hear that, I think, in the early Metallica, very early Metallica, more so than even where they'd go in 3 or 4 albums.
But yeah, I have this pet peeve about these super famous guys when they're asked about bands, because it's always a big deal when they shout out a band when you're one of the biggest rock stars in the world. And Lars, I don't hear him often saying, "Oh, Holocaust was a big deal." I mean, I think Savage was a bigger deal to him, and certainly Diamond Head even bigger, right? And Motorhead. But yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. They did cover them and stuff. I must say that this album did confuse us, and I think it was a bit of a misstep. It's always a misstep putting out a live album as your second album, number one. And number two, I mean, it's cool that there's lots and lots of non-original LP songs on it, right? Long the Bell Will Toll, No Nonsense, the instrumental, The Small Hours, of course, that's where you get this from. The song Metallica covered isn't even from the studio album, the lone studio album. And then that title just like bothered us, right? Yeah. Live, parentheses, hot curry and wine, right? It's like, it's not a pleasant sounding image, right? No, and it's not very heavy metal, and it's bringing food into it, and then it's just weird. And you're thinking of your stomach, getting in knots and indigestion and stuff. It's just very sort of undermining of the seriousness, right?
And sometimes things don't translate, and then when you hear like, "Oh, well, this is why they've called it that," and you think, "Okay, right, it's just context." No, this is just bad. This is bad over here as well for a title.
And this is curious as well. I mean, that's a great looking band shot, but again, I mean, I guess I kind of like the idea of a cartoony image of the band. I mean, they certainly look cool, right?
And they're also bringing in, with the black and white stripes, that you've even got Alex Harvey being brought into the mix, which
nice.
being a hard rock Scottish band, I'm sure would have been, something that was very much in their minds. Interesting though. I mean, we mentioned Lars there, and it's great that he obviously did have them on Garage Days with James. They kind of shared a list of, I think mixtapes that they would just trade back and forth to each other. But they were also covered by like Gamma Ray, and so they've been covered by a few different acts, but they've never had that real renaissance. And yet they're still going to this day, even though it's just John Mortimer's version. But what makes them kind of unique in that regard is there was never really a Holocaust lineup. It was always after this one record, it was always just Holocaust, and then whoever seems to have the rights to it this week doing Holocaust.
Yeah, and what a mess too. I mean,
Yeah.
for next you get Hologram Steal the Stars in 1983, and that's I was playing that again, and it's kind of what I always thought it was. When I reviewed these back in the day, it's kind of like a really, it's good album cover and cool, like Hologram, cool name, and Steal the Stars is cool, but that's where the classiness ends, because it's badly recorded, bad vocals. It's just this weird, ill-advised kind of like poppy, almost like neo-progressive music, but still recorded super raw and not much to the arrangement. So it's a little bit like the way Demon went, right?
Yeah.
You think of these new wave of British heavy metal bands, not the IQs and Marillions and Palaces, but more like the Saracens and Legends and Limelights and Demons, right? Where it's just like badly put together, but we think we're a prog band, but we're not sure. We're kind of a poppy band, a prog band, and then after that they go back to Holocaust and do No Man's Land, which is even weirder and dumber and unlikable, right? That one's kind of like it's got a bunch of like D-beat punk to it, but also the vocals aren't great. Also, the recording is not great, and even when they're trying to be D-beat punk or hardcore, whatever they're doing, they're like trying to infuse melody into it. So it's just this bizarre, weird 1984. Like, what is this? Where is this? How does this belong? So unfortunately you've got the one classic, and then this is essentially it always felt like, even though it's gatefold, which was cool on the original vinyl, it feels like a filled out EP kind of, because it's such an odds and sods. It's a mix of, and it's well recorded for live album. It's actually it sounds fine. You would think it would be terrible, but it's not. It's actually, in fact, it sounds better than the Hologram album and the No Man's Land.
Yeah.
But then they got to be a pretty cool band when they did reform and do stuff later on. Just like Savage and Holocaust, sort of their stars crossed, and they both became these later period new wave of British heavy metal bands coming out and making pretty good music.
Although Holocaust never played in England until 2013.
Wow.
Yeah, down the road, literally, to England. You there, Martin? So it wasn't until all those, so was that 33 years, 32 years after the original album comes out, that they actually even play just down the road in England. So you've got, in Scotland, you've got Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee, Aberdeen. You've only got a few bigs at Inverness now, but they didn't even make it to the north of England in their original run in any version.
Yeah, I either didn't know that or forgot that, but that might account for the reason why we never really heard from them much, and it might even account for their mystique a little bit, right? I mean, the idea that we didn't really ever know a lot about them. It was just this cool, spooky looking album cover, but obviously it accounts for why they never went too far. But of course, they did have their musical differences, as John told me. I mean, they remained friends. They didn't fight. Really, they just had these musical differences, and I guess somebody wanted to go punk, and somebody wanted to be prog, and somebody wanted to be more commercial. I remember him telling me that. But so it's funny. It's like the new wave of British heavy metal still had a couple, 3 years into it. I mean, people were essentially doing new wave of British heavy metal up until about the end of 1983.
Yeah.
And then everything kind of fell apart.
I mean, there's a quote in the booklet of the new box set where John even says myself and Nikki wanted to go around the metal road, increase the degree of abstraction from the rocks of metal, hard rock roots, sorry. In particular, we wanted to write heavier songs and experiment with extreme tempos. You know, you're coming onto the age of thrash, so that makes sense. The other three guys wanted to make Van Halen and Aerosmith type things.
Mm.
So obviously the connotations, as you mentioned, of doing Van Halen on, say, the 1980 EPs and whatnot, very different proposition from doing a Van Halen in 83. So the type of copycat band that they might have been for Van Halen in 83 was a bit more of a sellout than a Van Halen 1 or 2 type copycat might have been. So you can see why some of the guys who wanted to go really into the heaviness would have said, whoa. And then, as you said, you get this bizarre proposition where you start with this, where you've got absolutely everybody. And then the next time you hear from them, it's Hologram, and John's not in the back. Nobody's left apart from, well, what's his name? So it's not John, it's Ed Dudley. Ed Dudley is the other guitar player. He's the only member by the time of this, which is marketed as the second album, even though it's not, because the original hype sticker even says Holocaust are now Hologram. You think, oh, are they though? Are they? And then when John gets the inclination, he says, Hologram ain't happening anymore. We're coming back as Holocaust. And all of a sudden, he's the only original member. So within the two follow-up studio records, you've got one original member on each, and neither of them have any of the spark of this original. Neither of them. It's quite bizarre how that happens. Yeah. And in the middle, as you said, you have this ridiculously scuzzy idea of not just a live album. They made a video of it, which when they've only released one album that didn't sell massively, they decided to do a video and sell it for £30. In 1982 money, that's, you know, that's a lot. That's a lot. Albums were £7 or £8, so they made a VHS in 1982, which is just nuts to think that they thought they could get away with that. That obviously flopped, and then we get the live album. On this box set, we've got the Holocaust live from the same tour, and this is straight from the video soundtrack. And it's even got an advertisement for it on the back. It's not going to show because of the Zoom thing, but Holocaust live on video, $29.95, including VAT and P&P. Playing time 1 hour 20 minutes. Contains 4 new tracks, and again being sold by Phoenix Records. So it's as if they thought, oh, we'll come up with this wonderful new idea of, we've only done one album, let's go straight into a live video. But they've not cultivated any kind of audience that's going to pay £30 to buy anything to do with the band, never mind a live video at this point. It's even early for any band to be releasing a full concert film, never mind a relatively obscure Scottish metal band. It's a bizarre choice.
Yeah, and you listen to both Hologram and No Man's Land, and you go, okay, number one, these guys are not going to make it doing commercial music. And I don't think they could have made it doing thrash, although in their minds at that point, they're thinking speed metal. I mean, thrash doesn't really exist yet, but I doubt they could have really become that either. It's almost like the best thing they could have done is have a couple more new wave of British heavy metal albums. And, you know, I think John told me that debut sold 3,000 copies. You know, in its initial run. But yeah, I mean, I guess be part of the new wave British heavy metal and sell 30,000 copies or 20 or whatever for a couple of things. But yeah, I mean, just judging from what they got up to, it's almost like, you know, you hate to say it, but it's almost like the first album was a fluke and an accident, because I mean, they just seem so ill-advised, both those, that second and third album.
Yeah, I mean, they freely admit in the booklet that obviously being signed as the only act to a guy whose main job is owning a record store, they didn't have any kind of advice whatsoever. They're just a bunch of guys who are happy to be doing what they're doing. And there wasn't a massive, as they say themselves, there wasn't a massive metal band scene in Scotland. There was a massive metal scene to go to gigs, But Scotland, as funnily enough, we discussed on one of your videos on your channel, had a massive post-punk scene, a massive new wave scene, but not so much bands who were in heavy metal bands. So there's very few NWOBHM bands from Scotland, few notables, but very few indeed. So it's as though they were, yeah, Fluke's maybe a bit harsh, but it's that kind of small fish, and then they never did get to the never mind out of the bowl. They never got anywhere really after this in terms of commercial success.
Magic is a nicer word than fluke, right? It's
Yeah,
like the magic happened on this album, right?
the weird thing is, as you said, though, all the elements are here to tell you that they've got enough in it for a good 3 or 4 year run, and then maybe they can change into something else that they might not even have thought of back when they first started. Because on this, it's not as if it's just the same thing over and over again.
No.
Smoke and Vowels has got that wonderful punky mentality to it. You've got the wonderful Death or Glory, covered by 6 Feet Under later on. I mean, that's really doomy stuff. Really doomy stuff. The lyrics are intense and really dark. I mean, constantly singing about just loving rock and roll. Make no concessions to having to put in anything about love. I mean, I think there's even lyrics, if I remember right, that are ain't got time for women, ain't got time for booze, things like that. That you think, wow, that's just, they are pure rock and roll soldiers at this point. It's almost like it's almost like they've got the attitudes of 14-year-olds rather than 21-year-olds, whatever. They've got a really naive attitude, which is kind of wonderful.
And just I also, I guess, to comment on some of the songs. I mean, the Nightcomers is kind of dark and angel witchy, and Smoke and Valves, it's got the punk thing, but it's also the one of the ones that has a little bit of a boogie rock thing to it as well, right? And you've got Come On Back with that, it's sort of an up-tempo shuffle. I've got a funny one here though. So It Don't Matter to Me. Do you ever have I almost don't even want to talk about this because I turned down going on an episode about it because it's so haunting, but do you have 10 to 20 little snippets of songs that go through your head basically 5 times a day for your entire life? You know, like certain little riffs that just your fingers start tapping that, you know, just idly, right? It Don't Matter to Me, that like I literally played that part of that song in my head 5,000 times.
That's amazing.
And I have a bunch of those where you go, I mean, sometimes some of those little pieces of music are things I've heard like once or twice on an album I don't even listen to. And the last time I heard it was like 30 years ago, and it just goes through your head forever, right? I have a pile of those, right? But it's funny, when I was going through this again, I didn't even realize it. And I'm playing this album again yesterday, and I go, wow, that's one of those accursed little snippets of music that is always going through my head, like once every couple hours. It's really weird, right? I don't know if you have those, but
absolutely. Where it's not even an earworm song, it's an earworm moment. And if somebody asked you there and then, what is it you're humming, you wouldn't even realize you were doing it.
Yeah.
It's so,
and it comes up relentlessly, day after day, week after week. You've got this little shuffle of them, right?
Yeah.
You know, as a drummer, you have this problem where, you know, drummers are always tapping their fingers or tapping their pens or stuff, or tapping out a rhythm, right? So often they're rhythm based, and this one's kind of rhythm based, but it's pretty funny that that was there. Crying Shame's a good one too. Crying Shame, I was playing, it reminded me a little bit of their You Shook Me All Night Long, you know.
It's the closest they get to something that I think could have crossed over a little bit into singles territory, if not.
But it's interesting what you bring up. It's almost like the magic is here because this particular very specific music is their lane, and they proved it was their lane by how badly they covered lanes later on.
Well, they have no talent for writing anything with a bit of romance to it, for writing anything with a bit of sex to it, even the booze to it, even the druggy aspect, nothing like that. They have to be just rock and roll soldiers. And you mentioned even Come On Back there. Even that, which you can say is one of the most upbeat tracks in the album, is about a lover that's committed suicide. So the come on back part is saying,
Oh,
I'll join you in the next life,
okay, yeah,
by committing suicide. So I mean, even then, when they try and do something a bit, well, that could be a better relationship. She's already dead.
yeah,
So they really just don't have a
yeah.
kind of care in the world for
And
well,
when Gary
the
croons,
ballad.
he's like a little flat or he's a little sharp, but you
Yeah.
love him for it, right?
Yeah. Oh
Some
yeah.
some singers you're ticked off,
Yeah.
but this is like, oh, this sounds great,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, when he's singing lines about like, and it even throws in his own accent quite a lot of times as well.
Mm.
You know, where it's guitar, and you think, oh, crikey, that's even a bit. It's like he's doing a growl by accident. You know, before that was a whole scene in itself. But then you've even got their earlier influences like Mavrock, which is pure Sabbath. Very
Yeah.
Tony Iommi riff at the start. I mean, they couldn't be doing a more Sabbathy song if they tried to round off side one. So they did have ambition to do these relatively epic tracks for a band like them. So to go from this, I mean, side one starts with, yeah, as you said, it almost a little bit of boogie and a little bit, you know,
Artists.
yeah, and then we end up doing Sabbathy over the top doom stuff, which is such a turnaround. Yeah, it's quite insane. And I guess their anthem that'll always be there for them is Heavy Metal Mania
Yeah.
itself, the actual title track.
Heavy, 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 and then that wheedly little guitar riff that sounds like an error,
Yeah,
right?
and one of the genius ideas of it is to have everybody singing along to the "I've got heavy metal," and then it just cuts down to Gary going "music in my blood." So, but everybody sings the "I've got heavy metal." It's as if they're going right. So that's the part we want the audience to sing. Right, so
Yeah.
we'll tell them that on the record by having everybody singing it, everybody, including the cleaner in the studio, singing it on the record.
And that reminds me, like, obviously one of the big codifying things about the new wave of British heavy metal that's interesting is the idea that we're championing heavy metal and the Iron Maiden album cover and Judas Priest in their leather and the bikes and the studs and all that stuff and calling the album British Steel. And so Saxon, playing my music loud, kicked him to the ground, playing my Deep Purple, saying Deep Purple.
Yeah.
So I definitely remember back in 81, except, essentially that Heavy Metal Mania was one of the top new wave of British heavy metal anthems, period.
Yeah.
Because it's right there. It's right there in the title, right? And the chorus is undeniable, right?
Yeah, it's a mission statement. I mean, and then it sings literally in the song, rock and roll is far too slow. Adrenaline just don't flow. Where's the power? Where is the glory? Because heavy metal is my story.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you think, wow, you have written just a perfect anthem for people that didn't know they needed an anthem. You've separated NWOBHM as we've come to know it from just rock and roll music. And the weird thing is, they're kind of renouncing rock and roll for being far too slow when the whole album starts with a perfect rock and roll thing go. It's as if they don't even realize what they've done themselves, which is, again.
And a third of this is really slow.
Yeah.
It's slow, doomy metal, right?
So it's almost like they have a lack of awareness or just a kind of devil may care. Hey, this was our EP from last year. We'll throw it on there. We'll re-record it. We'll take it the Raid Siren part. Yeah, we'll see what works, and then we'll see how it pans out. Because yeah, they're denouncing rock and roll after coming up with some rock and roll bangers, which is just brilliant. So the original Contrarian band, if you will, they're denouncing what they've just done on side one. And then, funny. As you said, the Nightcomers itself it almost surprises me every time I hear it that it's so ambitious in scope for a band to, at times, especially if you're familiar with the live record as we are, at times the band are almost inept's far too harsh a word, but they're just not well rehearsed and drilled, and they haven't been together for years and years. They've traded members enough times that it's like everybody's, and we know they're pulling in different directions towards which type of rock and metal to go to. And then all of a sudden they make this Nightcomers, which throws everything into the mix. It's doomy, It's progressive. It does have twin guitar parts that are absolutely outstanding. It's got amazing double tracking. It's one of the few tracks where the rhythm section get to absolutely be on top of the guitars rather than just kind of, there is a rhythm section in there somewhere. Um, it's a wonderful track to go out on. It's like
Yeah, and it's got a ton of atmosphere too. So it reminds you, it gives you the atmosphere of that first Angel Witch album, or even Baphomet from Metal from Others. It also gives you the atmosphere of the heavy end of Witch Find on the Give 'Em Hell album, and Stage Fright when they're heavy on Stage Fright, right? So yeah, you definitely, and you know, you just put that together with the album cover, and it's a pretty good spooky package at times when they want.
And then to end with, on the track, to end with just a cacophony of like feedback and just that's more punky than anything, where they're just kind of, it's as if they can't be bothered coming up with anything artistic at the end of the track, and then it just comes to a shattering halt, like mid note, mid feedback, it just goes, you think, well, I've got a dodgy copy here, I better return this. What's going to, it's a wonderful esoteric choice, and that leads me to think that the band were a little bit more knowing than we're maybe giving them credit for at parts. I think they did have a sense of humor about it, that they did know that, wait a minute, how can we be denouncing rock and roll when our first track on this album is a pure rock and roll? Who cares? Just go with it. I think they do have a sense of humor about the whole thing. And I think that shows on the live stuff as well, because stage banter is not the best, but they're certainly trying on it. It's just a bizarre band to me that they have this. They've got enough of a legacy that all these decades later, they've got a box here from Cherry Red Records, which very ambitiously is called Volume 1. And the complete recordings, Volume 1, 1980 to 1984. Well, there's a few EPs from the late 80s and early 90s. And then there's nothing until 2013. So I think the volume 1 here might have been a bit unnecessary. But,
well, and how stupid is it calling it the Complete Recordings Volume 1?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Heavy Metal Mania, Complete Recordings, Volume 1, 1980 to 1984. First of all, even if they do have the license for the later stuff, that's such a different market anyway. They're not going to be selling it to the same crowds. And if you only have the license for the next few EPs, you've not got enough for a box set anyway. So yeah, maybe Cherry Red caught on to some of that kind of bizarre, scuzzy notions that the band seemed to be extolling on that debut. But so you obviously named the book after them. They were mentioned by you as releasing one of the 15 definitive albums.
Yeah.
Is that enough for them to have secured a legacy, do you think, or will they remain kind of, you have to already be into the scene to know them, or will they, do you think they'll ever have any kind of staying
No,
power?
I mean, I've always thought they were famous enough as part of the thing. You know, the fact that you don't have a ton of albums out doesn't really make a difference, because a lot of those bands are on that list of the 15 for just literally having one or two albums, right?
Yeah.
Or one or two on the list. You know, I think of the band More. Man, you know, like, I don't like the first More album very much, but it's really well put together, and a lot of people do like it. It's got Paul Mario Day on it, but that second one, Blood and Thunder, definitely has got to be in my top 3, I would say. For any, and they only made the 2 albums, and that was a weird one. That
one of the most ironically
out
named bands of all time. Yeah.
yeah, exactly right. Yeah,
Their
so
box set.
what a brilliant album. But you know, and Quartz had a few albums, but I mean that, you know, they're on my list for you know, well, what do we got? The first one with the oddly named Quartz, and then deleted in the paper bag, and then they put out a live album. They did the same thing.
Yeah.
They put out a live album as their second album, right?
I can't think what the inspiration was. It's as if there was some band that we're not thinking of who did release a second album as their live album, and it did really well.
Or A to Z put out a live album as their first album.
Yeah, I mean, MC5 and things going back. You can even hear a bit of MC5 in here if you really want to think that's in there. You can hear some kind of late 60s really hard rock. But yeah, they're just a wonderfully odd band who, I don't want to say accidentally made a masterpiece, because I don't think you can do this entirely on accident. I think you have to have a real talent. But you're right, it's almost like just the stars aligned perfectly. What, you know, Halley's Comet only shows every few hundred years, so whatever, that kind of thing. No matter what lineups they tried, no matter what permutations, nothing after this is really worth talking about after the initial record, be it Hologram or Holocaust. It's kind of bizarre, really.
You know, the way it's not an accident also is the fact that this is a little bit like, well, so Metallica, it's funny. So Metallica kind of when they played live before they had a record out, they were being Holocaust. But
Yeah.
when they put the record out, they had advanced things and literally invented a new kind of music. But Holocaust is basically being the same thing as Metallica live in that these are really, really smart, enthusiastic music fans at a young age, you know, pouring everything into their music, what they know, which is actually a lot for where they are at their age. So you know, for being 17 or 18 years old making this, you know, you could tell they're obviously like big music fans already. They're,
Yeah.
they're not faking it. They're giving you a very, you know, worthwhile synthesis of all the heavy metal that's been poured into their heads since you know they were probably 10 or 11 years old, kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, I think that sums it up perfectly. That they are musically probably not far ahead of a band that should be doing just three chord Chuck Berry stuff in terms of actual skill. You know, nobody's going to confuse any of these guys with the more advanced players of rock music, but the synergy amongst them, the knowledge that you can just hear from them, and the sense of, it's a bit like the Undertones Teenage Kicks, the sense of you've just kind of captured not just the zeitgeist of a time, but of an age of the people in that time. And that will always abide. You know, that heavy metal mania, every generation can still resonate with that one sentiment, if not the actual song itself. Every generation's got a heavy metal mania where it's that one song, that anthem that kind of sums up your generation. You know, my generation, literally, I suppose, would be the first example of it you can think of.
Yeah.
And lightning in a bottle is probably a better way to think of it than a fluke or anything like that. Because yeah, they are bizarrely still going to this day under John's leadership, under John Mortimer's leadership. They released an album only 4 years ago, and when people always do have this, oh, it's not a legit lineup for legacy bands, don't they? Like Tigers have just released a new album and it's brilliant, and oh, it's not real Tigers, it's only Rob that's left. Well, this band never had a legacy. They were onto a completely different lineup by album two, and then a completely different one again by album three. Completely different. So I mean, it's an odd story that I think deserves a bit more of a spotlight, and I'm glad we've been able to shine something on it.
Yeah. And you know, one final point is the importance of a lead singer, right? The lead singer means so much to this. The
Yeah,
lead singer is so much of the personality of this record. So yeah, you can't really do this later without him,
yeah,
sort of thing, right?
yeah,
So yeah, I mean he's literally, well, this does, it's so magical because it does feel like a group effort. So this isn't one where I'm going to say the lead singer is 50% of the whole thing, because
yeah,
it's maybe a little less than that, but in many cases the lead singer is 50-80% of
yeah.
the reason. You know, we have this talk about Vandenberg, right? Vandenberg just feels like any band without that guy, right,
Yeah.
you know, and it's just too bad, but that's the way it is.
And to go back to a band who they said they were influenced by, or some of them were, Van Halen. I mean, Dave was never a classical singer in the traditional sense, but he has the attitudes and just the pomp and the people can resonate with. Sammy comes in and he's on paper 10 times the singer, but there's just not the chemistry and there's just not the alchemy that's kind of there in the peak of the connection with the audience. That's just, you can't buy that for love nor money. There's technically great singers in bands who just don't convince you that they believe what they're saying at all. Whereas there's not a moment on this record that I don't think they 100% are into this. They are enthusiastic as hell and they're loving every second of it.
Yeah, and we danced around it, but we should say it. I mean, this guy reminds you of David Lee Roth, right?
Yeah.
You know, vocally, the tonally, the spoken, the lapsing between spoken. Henry Rollins used to do this as well, but
Yeah.
he actually spoke even more. But David Lee Roth is a perfect example of, you could hear Gary drifting in. I'm not sure. Am I supposed to be singing right now, or am I
Yeah.
supposed to be just shouting and talking right now? Right?
Yeah.
Oh, I can't remember, but anyways, it sounds okay. I've got from these three words over here to these ones over here. So it's a conversational kind of vocal thing, and and it comes off as cool. You think he's a cool dude.
Yeah. Yeah. It's cool because it's not trying to be cool, and it's not. There's always an element of artists who are just a bit too far beyond you, where they're a bit too detached. It doesn't sound like you could ever be part of them, part of that scene. These do sound like the guys next door, even if they are a very, very talented bunch of guys next door. They do still seem as if I could do that if I really tried, So there isn't that barrier either. Whereas you do listen to the most slick recordings of Van Halen or an Aerosmith and whatnot, and you think that's just a major band, and I could never do anything like that in my life.
Yeah.
Whereas these guys, you think, give me a few months, I could be up to their standards. That's no problem whatsoever. And that gives that kind of appeal as well, that kind of naivety, that kind of charm. And yeah, you're right, that front man who technically isn't great, but has all the charisma. He's never the guy that's going to be writing vocal melodies and lines, because he'll probably never sing it the same way twice, as we know from some of the. So it really is probably lightning in a bottle in the studio as well. I'd imagine they had to pick from different takes and just magically just boom, 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 got all the correct answers down. So any closing thoughts, Martin, before we?
No, I think we covered it all. That's very cool. It's a good tribute to this album.
Yeah, no. So again, just been released from Cherry Red's Heavy Metal Mania, the imaginatively titled Complete Recordings Volume 1, 1980 to 1984. We eagerly anticipate Volume 2, which I'm going to make a bet will never happen. Will absolutely never happen. However, that would be very Holocaust for it to, or they could release a bunch of recordings by a completely different band and call that Volume 2. That might be more fitting. Martin, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. So
Yeah.
people can find you on the Contrarians. Obviously, it's your show. What's getting published? Plug something?
Well, there's that. There's the audio podcast, History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff. We're up to 203 episodes of that. The books, what has been, oh yeah, the Rush books, the Rush hardcovers are running out. So there's no more Anthem. Limelight's almost gone. There's still Drivens for probably a while, but they're all available in softcover. But I've had a flurry of those go out. But the latest ones are the big David Bowie at 75, AC/DC at 50, and the Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon. That's all at martinpopoff.com.
Yeah, and those Pink Floyd books, I can't look at anything on Amazon UK without being recommended that. So I hope that's done well for you, because it's well, they are shopping that for you if nothing else. That is unreal.
Well, the entire print run ran out just in time for the 50th anniversary
Yes.
of the album. So we spent the 50th anniversary for 3 months without having any books, and then they put it back in print.
And wonderfully, your book got in there before the official book, and the official book doesn't look as good as your book. So I think you've stolen a few sales from Pink Floyd.
Yeah.
Although I'm going to guess they can probably afford to take the hit.
Yeah, I think so.
Martin, a pleasure, my friend.
All right. Thank you very much.
Take care, everybody. Thank you very much.